The next controversy to study is the role of the United Nations and its significance in the prosecution of the Korean War. How far was the Korean War a UN war? The United Nations, founded in 1945 after the end of World War II by the victorious Allied powers. The aim of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure that the armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. The hope was that the United Nations would act to prevent and intervene in conflicts between nations and make future wars impossible or limited. 5 permanent members of the Security Council each had the right to a veto. By 1955, this veto, or ability to stop the United Nations acting on any way that wasn't in that country's interests, had been used 78 times, of which 75 times had been by the Soviet Union. The 5 permanent members with this ability to veto or stop the action of the United Nations were China, the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States. China's veto, however, at this time was being exercised by the nationalist Chinese regime based in Taiwan or Formosa, not by Mao's new People's Republic of China. Timeline of the United Nations activity in the Korean War. The United Nations Committee was set up to arrange elections for a united Korea at the end of the Second World War, following the partition of Korea along the 38th parallel between a Soviet-dominated North and American-dominated South. In 1948, elections were held in South Korea. In 1949, the Soviet Union walks out of the United Nations and the Security Council, as the United States would not let Communist China into the UN and use the veto that was allocated to the nationalist regime in Taiwan. Of course, when the Soviets left, they took with them their right to veto. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea. On the 27th of June, Truman agrees to send troops and military supplies to South Korea. The UN is then asked to ratify this, not as American action on their own, unilateral action of the United States, but as the action of the United Nations. US troops therefore would be operating as UN troops. The United Nations called on the North Koreans to retreat and recommended that its troops withdraw from South Korea. On the 7th of June, the United Nations passed a resolution asking for its members to supply assistance, troops and supplies, and asked the United States to appoint a commander of the forces in South Korea, bearing in mind that the majority of the troops were provided by the US. This was logically going to be an American commander. On the 7th of October, the United Nations ratified a decision of the US to move north of the 38th parallel, the wording of which was all appropriate steps should be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea, for the establishment of a united, independent and democratic government in the sovereign state of Korea. In essence, not acknowledging that there were 2 separate parts of Korea, North and South, but one country for the entire Korean peninsula. Read through the cards provided. Sort them into 2 groups. Those which show the war was a US war, and those that suggest that the war was prosecuted by the United Nations. Obviously, the overlap is for statements that represent both of the above. This will be the basis for a discussion and subsequent essay assignment on whether the war in Korea was a UN or US war.